This is the heartbreaking real crime documentary Hidden Truths, Broken Vows, a trans wife's secret identity exposed by husband on wedding day. When a secret was disclosed at the altar, what ought to have been a happy union took a terrible turn, resulting in treachery, mayhem, and death. Remember to subscribe for more captivating stories if you enjoy real-life tragedies and startling surprises. Join the conversation by liking, commenting, and sharing. Your participation enables us to unearth more disturbing facts. I appreciate you viewing. Today, we explore a terrible murder that took place on what should have been a happy wedding day. When the groom openly disclosed his bride's transgender identity in front of all of their guests, the festivities took an unexpected turn. A fatal encounter ensued, during which the facts came to light in unexpected ways. At Ohio State University, 32-year-old Brandon Whitmore was a rising assistant professor of political science. In the classroom and at social gatherings, he was renowned for his charm and self-assurance. But his personal life had always been more complicated, even in spite of his success at the workplace. Brandon frequently lost his temper and ignored warning signs in relationships since he tended to act impulsively. He met Melissa Stanislav, a 28-year-old Columbus, Ohio, high school girls basketball coach, at the beginning of 2015. They met by chance at a local charity event where Melissa was tutoring a group of young girls from disadvantaged neighborhoods, and it felt like fate. Her poise and elegance immediately captured Brandon's attention, starting a discussion that swiftly developed into a passionate affair. Their common passions in athletics, fitness, and education brought them together right away, and soon they were organizing a wedding. But even though they had developed a strong emotional connection, there were early warning indicators. Despite their devotion, there were conflicts and unresolved concerns in their relationship. Melissa kept several parts of her life private, especially her history. Her friends saw that Brandon was reluctant to divulge personal information, particularly regarding her background. Although it created concerns, she was insistent about avoiding showing Brandon any pictures from her early years. But Brandon disregarded these warning signs. He was enthralled with Melissa's beauty and charm and was fervently committed to the prospect of a future with her. Friends and relatives questioned her privacy, especially regarding her early years, but Brandon dismissed their worries. He thought that any holes in their connection could be filled by love. The couple's goal was to have a lavish wedding at the historic church in downtown Columbus in late June 2015. Many of Brandon's Ohio State co-workers were among the guests invited from all over Ohio, and everything appeared to be coming together for a lovely, customary wedding. But Melissa's long-kept secrets started to come to light, and things started to fall apart in the most disastrous and widely reported way possible. What ought to have been their most joyful day swiftly devolved into a nightmare. Brandon Whitmore's body was found in the men's lavatory of the Trinity Episcopal Church in downtown Columbus, Ohio, on the afternoon of June 27, 2015. At approximately 3:30 p.m. only a few hours prior, the church was the venue for Brandon and Melissa's wedding ceremony. A terrible, untimely death marked the conclusion of what started out as a celebration of love and dedication. When groomsman Greg Langston realized that Brandon had been gone for an abnormally lengthy period of time, more than 3 hours, the celebration was still bustling with laughter and conversation. Greg, worried, went to look for him and went to the locked bathroom door. His anxiousness increased as he knocked and called out to Brandon and got no response. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open. Greg entered and saw a terrible scene. Brandon's pants were around his ankles as his limp body sagged against the toilet stall. He had multiple gunshot wounds on his torso and crotch, and the walls and floor of the restroom were covered in blood. Stumbling backward from the shock, Greg yelled for assistance. As guests hurried to the wedding reception, panic broke out. His voice trembling, he hurriedly contacted 911 to report the horrifying finding. Within minutes, the paramedics were there, but their efforts were futile because Brandon was pronounced dead at the scene. Despite being clearly shaken, Greg remained calm as he told the first responders the sobering details. As soon as guests heard the horrific news, the tumultuous wedding reception atmosphere swiftly changed to one of horror and incredulity. What ought to have been a happy celebration had devolved into a tragic scene, igniting a series of events that would uncover long-kept truths and change everyone's lives involved. As the wedding guests, still wearing their formal attire, came to terms with the horrific reality, the toilet swiftly turned into a crime scene and was cordoned off. Everyone was shocked to learn that the happy celebration had turned into a terrible nightmare. Soon after, Columbus police officers showed up, which heightened the tense situation. Guests' first reactions ranged from astonishment to bewilderment as they tried to process what had just happened. There were murmurs of incredulity. And the happy buzz of the reception gave way to a spooky quiet, broken only by the sirens in the distance and the inquiry that was being conducted. After going missing for some time, Melissa soon became the focus of the inquiry as investigators attempted to put together the violent and chaotic events that occurred just transpired. Detective Ray Mathis and Columbus Police responded to the 911 call quickly. The investigation is being handled by an experienced investigator who is renowned for his meticulous and methodical approaches. In an attempt to make sense of the horrific event that had destroyed what ought to have been a happy occasion, he started to evaluate the situation by collecting evidence and speaking with witnesses. After carefully inspecting the bathroom where Brandon Whitmore was found, Mathis and his crew secured the crime scene. Blood splattered over the floor and walls created a somber scene, and Brandon's body, with his pants down and several bullet wounds to his crotch and chest, indicated that a fierce battle had taken place. Knowing that every piece of evidence would be essential to comprehending the circumstances leading up to this awful moment, the investigator took note of every detail. Additionally, Brandon had defensive wounds on his arms, which showed that he had retaliated against his assailant. The murder weapon, a tiny revolver, was eventually discovered by investigators in a garbage can outside the church. It seemed to have been hurriedly discarded and fingerprint-free, which raised questions about the attacker's intention to conceal their identity. In an effort to piece together the circumstances leading up to the murder, detectives promptly started interviewing the attendees. They discovered something startling. The wedding celebration, which had taken place just before Brandon's murder, was characterized by witnesses as a wild scene. Guests complained about Melissa's odd behavior and noisy debates, and a rising tension that appeared to intensify all night long. While several attendees remembered Melissa leaving the room suddenly shortly before Brandon vanished, others saw that he had seemed more and more upset. Several reports claimed that Brandon suddenly and shockingly lost his temper in front of the wedding guests. He got up and started yelling, "My bride's a guy," during the reception toast shortly after the ceremony. Pointing to Melissa and said it again. The crowd fell silent in shock as he revealed that Melissa was a transgender woman who still had male genitalia. As the guests assimilated the shocking discovery, the atmosphere changed abruptly. Some were obviously uncomfortable, while others expressed incredulity. As Brandon continued his public outburst, scolding Melissa for keeping her trans identity a secret from him, the guests watched in horror. According to witnesses, Melissa was so humiliated and heartbroken by Brandon's harsh disclosure that she fled the reception area in tears. With guests unsure of how to react to the stunning revelation, the wedding celebration was thrown into disarray. While others tried to comfort Melissa as she ran away, others just stood there in shock, trying to process the shocking and agonizing reality that had been revealed. The happy event soon devolved into a confused and distressed spectacle. While some people rushed after Melissa, others attempted to comfort Brandon. His tantrum offered a blatant display of humiliation, treachery, and rage. Melissa had disappeared from the church following the incident, so the police immediately turned their attention to her. Detective Mathis started looking for her with his crew, realizing that she was the final person to be spotted with Brandon prior to his passing. As the inquiry went on, the authorities focused on learning more about the relationship between the couple, the wedding, and the violent altercation that had resulted in such a fatal outcome. The joyous occasion quickly transformed into a scene of confusion and distress. Some guests tried to console Brandon, while others hurried after Melissa. His outburst provided a clear mood of humiliation, betrayal, and anger. The police quickly shifted their focus to Melissa, who had vanished from the church after the incident. Detective Mathis and his team began searching for her, recognizing she was the last person seen with Brandon before his death. As the investigation progressed, the police concentrated on gathering more details about the couple's relationship, the wedding itself, and the explosive confrontation that had led to such a deadly conclusion. Whitmore, Melissa after Brandon's death, Stanislav, 28, was almost immediately named as the main suspect. Following Brandon's startling public outburst, Melissa left the wedding reception, leaving a distraught audience behind. She was typically calm and refined, according to friends and relatives, but she had grown more anxious in the months before the wedding. She had suffered from the burden of concealing from Brandon a major aspect of who she was, that she was transsexual. Melissa, whose real name was Nell Stanislav, had realized she was transsexual when she was a teenager, but she had never told Brandon about it. She was afraid that telling people would make them reject her and ruin the future she had planned for herself. Melissa kept her background a secret during their frenzied relationship out of fear that it would ruin everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Their relationship became more tense as the wedding day drew near. Questions had always been made about Melissa's conservative approach to physical contact, but she insisted that she valued waiting until marriage. Despite his growing frustration, Brandon complied with her requests in the hopes that their wedding would be a turning point. But Melissa was under a lot of pressure to keep her secret, and the delicate equilibrium she had managed to maintain started to fall apart in the days before the wedding. Brandon was surprised and furious at this startling revelation. According to what investigators eventually discovered, he confronted Melissa right away and demanded to know why she had kept her true identity a secret from him. Melissa begged for forgiveness and understanding throughout the heated and emotional confrontation that followed, while Brandon found it difficult to comprehend what he had just discovered. The couple chose to proceed with the wedding despite their passionate argument, even though it was obvious that their mutual trust had been damaged. Even when Brandon seemed to relax, there was still tension between him and Melissa. In the days before the wedding, friends and relatives became aware of his strange conduct. However, the subsequent cataclysmic events were beyond anyone's ability to foresee. Melissa was embarrassed in front of everyone on the wedding day when Brandon's internal conflict eventually exploded into a public tantrum. Brandon had obviously not gone past the treachery he felt, even if they appeared to have reconciled. What ought to have been a happy celebration of love swiftly devolved into a terrible altercation that led to the horrifying murder that shattered both families. Despite her intense love for Brandon, Melissa was unable to be completely honest about who she was because of her fear of rejection and her financial situation. Surgical reassignment, however, she barely made ends meet as a high school girls' basketball coach. She was concerned that she might lose everything: her job, her neighborhood, and most importantly, Brandon, if her trans identity became public, and the expense of the treatment appeared unaffordable. Melissa sensed the pressure building as the wedding day drew near. She still thought that her love for Brandon would be enough to get her through any difficulties, even if it was getting harder to preserve the secret she had carried for so long. Unfortunately, the delicate link they had formed was shattered by Brandon's revelation of the truth, which resulted in the tragic events that would shock everyone who knew them. Melissa was always worried that she might lose everything because of her secret. She was afraid of losing her job if the school found out, which would ruin her plans for the future. Even while transgender rights were becoming more widely recognized in 2015, prejudice was still pervasive, particularly in conservative neighborhoods like the one where Melissa lived and worked. Melissa found herself in a challenging situation after Brandon's unintentional discovery, one that rapidly got out of hand. Melissa was obviously upset but maintained her composure when being questioned by the cops. She was apprehensive, as evidenced by the way her eyes darted about the room, but she remained calm and spoke quietly and courteously during the interrogation. Melissa firmly denied killing Brandon, but she acknowledged that after his furious outburst at the reception, she had been worried about what he may do. Melissa acknowledged her worries to the police during their interview, stating that Brandon wasn't the type to simply let things go. "I was afraid he would destroy my life," Melissa added. "I might lose my job." As a ladies' basketball coach at a nearby high school, Melissa knew that disclosing her trans identity may result in her losing her job, and all she had fought so hard to achieve would be lost. Given that she couldn't afford the gender reassignment surgery required to match her body with her actual self, the financial and emotional consequences would be crippling. Melissa insisted she was innocent of Brandon's murder in spite of these worries. "He wasn't killed by me," she added, her voice shaking as the situation's reality set in. "I would never do that." As the investigation went on, the police continued to have doubts despite observing her discomfort. The second person the police spoke with throughout their inquiry was Melissa's mother, Gina Stanislav, 54. Gina, who was originally from San Francisco, was a witty individual who was well known for her unusual way of life and strong beliefs. She was accustomed to questioning social norms as a tenured professor of Tibetan Buddhism at Ohio State University. They soon learned throughout the detective's interrogation that Gina had a complicated connection with gender norms and identity, just like her daughter. Even though she was married, she openly told investigators that she liked dressing as a guy and going to gay bars to have sex with gay men. She told the cops, "I like to challenge gender binaries," as a way to express herself. She added, "It's liberating," surprising the detectives with her candor. Gina was very protective of her daughter Melissa, even though she had frank opinions about gender and sexuality. Gina admitted that she had been keeping Melissa's gender identity a secret from Brandon because she thought that telling him would endanger her daughter's future. She confided in the investigators, "But I told her not to tell him. The repercussions could be disastrous for her career as a girls' basketball coach as well as for Brandon. I didn't want Melissa to lose everything because the world isn't kind to her." Gina steadfastly denied any suggestion that she was involved in Brandon's murder during her interrogation. "I would never harm anyone," she declared, her voice growing more passionate. "My daughter and her husband were the ones who got married at that event." Gina insisted that I had nothing to do with it. The police were unable to ignore her tumultuous relationship with Brandon, which had been apparent over time, despite her strong denial. Gina had never liked his treatment of Melissa, particularly when he publicly humiliated her in front of family and friends during the wedding. Investigators believe that one of the possible motivations for Gina's behavior may have been her resentment of Brandon. Her disobedience and emotional instability only strengthened their suspicions, regardless of her claims to the contrary. "You don't have the whole story," she said, clearly frustrated. At one especially difficult moment, she lost her temper and insisted Brandon wasn't who he appeared to be. "I would stop at nothing to keep my kids safe from the harm he caused her." The detectives were even more interested in the facts behind the turbulent relationship because of the depth of her reaction, which suggested deeper difficulties. Despite her insistence on her innocence, this statement only made the officer more suspicious of her possible involvement in the case. Gina continued to play a crucial role in the inquiry, and her complicated connections with Melissa and Brandon sparked additional questions. The investigation then took a sharp turn on July 1, 2015. Detectives in Columbus, Ohio, got a tip on a hot afternoon that would change the course of the investigation. An important piece of information regarding Brandon Whitmer's murder was revealed by a wedding guest. This visitor claimed that for several months prior to the wedding, Brandon had been having an affair with Chloe Whitmer, his adoptive sister. The investigation was upended by this discovery, which also introduced a new level of intricacy. Investigators immediately turned their focus on Chloe, a 26-year-old who had always been close to Brandon. But nobody had suspected that their friendship had gotten too personal. Throughout Brandon's engagement to Melissa, the affair had persisted. Chloe started sowing doubts in Brandon's head in the days before the wedding. For additional information, go to nizagrant.com. Implying that Melissa was concealing something important. Chloe, who had long had doubts about Melissa's genuine identity, decided to look into it more using her close relationship with Brandon. The toxic dynamic that Chloe's jealousy of Melissa and her complex relationship with Brandon fostered may have contributed significantly to the wedding day's events, according to investigators. Because she had been using their affair to dominate and manipulate Brandon, her treachery went farther. Brandon and Chloe grew more protective of one another as their relationship grew stronger. Chloe understood that everything may be ruined if she revealed Melissa's secret. She was unaware of the consequences of Brandon's public outburst at the wedding, though. When he lost his anger and publicly humiliated Melissa in front of their guests, her plan to keep him under control by keeping information from him failed tragically. Investigators started to believe that this affair held the secret to revealing the intricate familial dynamics at work. Brandon may have acted explosively during the wedding reception as a result of the emotional upheaval brought on by the deceit and betrayal he experienced. But shortly, attention turned to Chloe, who was now being closely examined as a potential co-conspirator or catalyst for what happened that evening. The terrible events leading up to the fatal encounter in the church restroom were depicted in greater detail by this new material as well as witness accounts from the wedding. An important turning point in the investigation was Melissa's humiliation, which was made worse by Chloe's affair with Brandon. As the investigation progressed, investigators turned their attention to Brandon's adopted sister, Chloe Whitmore, age 26, in an attempt to determine whether or not she was involved in the chaotic events of that tragic day. Because of her romance with Brandon, Chloe, a vibrant bartender who was renowned for causing trouble in the family, found herself at the heart of the investigation. When investigators brought her in for interrogation on July 2, 2015, she startled them with an open confession. Her manner changed from casual to serious as she sat in the questioning room, disclosing information that would alter the investigation's direction. Months prior to the wedding, Chloe acknowledged having a brief affair with Melissa. Being a Chinese adopted daughter, she frequently felt uncomfortable in her mostly white household. Her tendency of self-destructive conduct was influenced by her careless and irresponsible lifestyle as well as her sense of alienation. Chloe talked candidly about her long-standing struggle with alcoholism during her police interview. A battle she had concealed from the majority of her relatives. She admitted that some of her most unfortunate decisions, such as having affairs with Melissa and Brandon, were caused by her drinking. Chloe described the tumultuous state of her life at the time by narrating how she and Melissa first became romantically involved on a drunken night soon after Brandon and Melissa began dating. According to Chloe, the romance was short-lived but intense. Because Melissa confided in her about the difficulties she was facing, she discovered that Melissa was transgender throughout their romance. In order to strengthen their relationship during that turbulent period, Melissa confided in Chloe about her anxieties and insecurities while still undergoing surgery and unable to pay for gender transition surgery. Despite accepting Melissa's transgender identity, Chloe said she understood the danger if Brandon ever found out. She was faced with the choice of telling Brandon what she knew or keeping quiet about it. Despite the growing evidence against her, Chloe adamantly denied any role in Brandon's death when investigators pressed her further. Chloe made it clear that she never intended for things to get violent, even if she had told Brandon the information out of envy. She did show some remorse for what she had done, but it seemed that she was more concerned with the consequences of her personal decisions than the seriousness of the murder. Her apparent lack of interest during the interrogation prompted investigators to suspect her complicity even more. Chloe didn't seem to be as upset about losing her brother as she was about clearing herself. Her disclosure of the romance with Melissa, however, gave important background information about the complex relationships that might have contributed to the catastrophe. Despite being indirect, her involvement showed that the Whitmore family relationships were far more complicated than the investigators had initially thought. Melissa Whitmore was identified as the real murderer by the police on the morning of July 1, 2015. Detectives came to the conclusion that Melissa killed her husband, Brandon Whitmore, in a fit of wrath and humiliation after spending days investigating the tumultuous circumstances leading up to the wedding. Their case against Melissa was finally cemented by her mental agony after Brandon's severe public outburst, even though the evidence had been building for some time. The tipping point was when Brandon publicly humiliated Melissa by yelling, "My bride's a guy," several times during the wedding reception. Witnesses described how Melissa fled in tears after Brandon told their friends and family that she was transgender. Investigators quickly discovered that Melissa, who was already dealing with the anxiety of losing her job as a high school basketball coach in the event that her secret was revealed, finally lost it due to Brandon's treachery. Melissa followed Brandon as he withdrew to the church restroom following his startling outburst. What followed was a heated and tumultuous altercation. Investigators said Brandon, who was still furious and perhaps drunk, threatened to ruin Melissa's life even worse, starting a furious dispute between them. Melissa rushed for a little revolver she had stashed among her possessions in a moment of panic. She shot Brandon many times as the altercation swiftly got out of hand, leaving him bleeding out in the restroom. Although he had fought back, as seen by the defensive wounds on his body, the closed bathroom door implied Melissa had locked herself inside with him during the conflict. There were no obvious fingerprints to identify the murder weapon, which was discovered hurriedly thrown in a nearby garbage can. But what caught the investigators' eye was Melissa's inconsistent actions in the days after the murder. She was described by friends as emotionally broken, reclusive, and on the verge of a collapse. When the police faced Melissa with the growing evidence on July 1, she first tried to disassociate herself from the murder. She seemed to accept the truth of her circumstances and be resigned to her fate when the police showed up at her flat to make the arrest. She did not resist arrest and maintained her composure. While some members of the community were taken aback by the announcement, others believed it was an inevitable outcome. Melissa's arrest elicited conflicting responses from the Whitmore family, who are still dealing with the aftermath of their private secrets being made public. While some were relieved that the truth was at last being revealed, others were upset and disappointed. Their family had been ripped apart by the incident, and everyone was left wondering how they had come to such a terrible conclusion. While some family members were relieved, others found it difficult to accept the tragedy that had occurred. The courtroom became a staging ground for the drama surrounding Brandon Whitmore's wife Melissa Whitmore Stanislav's trial in the months after his murder. Joe Doems, the 42-year-old prosecutor, was honored for his unwavering resolve and dominant demeanor in the courtroom. He was a strong opponent because of his reputation for seeking justice. He provided a clear picture for the prosecution as he painstakingly developed the case against Melissa, exposing the complexities of the murder and the connections that had led to that terrible night, arguing that Melissa acted out of rage and humiliation after Brandon publicly exposed her trans identity on their wedding day. During the trial, Melissa's motivation atoms were revealed. Her dread of losing everything she had worked for, including her position as a high school basketball coach, added to her humiliation in front of friends and family. He underlined that Melissa reached a breaking point as a result of Brandon's deception and the emotional upheaval it produced. Adams went on to explain the tumultuous altercation in the restroom, describing how Melissa was driven to carry out the unimaginable crime by the emotional intensity of the situation and Brandon's threats to ruin her life. The goal of the prosecutor's story was to make the jurors feel sorry for the defendant, aiming to frame the events as a tragic consequence of a complex web of relationships and betrayal, culminating in the crucial choice that permanently altered Melissa's life. She felt her entire universe crumble around her in that moment. The prosecutor presented evidence from the incident, emphasizing Brandon's defensive wounds that indicated a vigorous altercation and the revolver found in a nearby garbage can. By portraying Brandon's death as a crime of passion, the prosecution aimed to convince the jury that Melissa's emotional distress was a major contributing factor. Attorney Moral Jennings Ossobranco, 36, who was known for her calm manner and methodical approach, was on the defense team. She argued that Melissa was a victim of events that grew out of her control rather than a murderer. Jennings Ossobranco argued that this was a terrible incident motivated by intense emotional struggle. She highlighted Melissa's emotional suffering by pointing out that she had left the reception crying following Brandon's outburst. Melissa, who had never meant to hurt her spouse, was represented by Jennings Ossobranco as a lady who was extremely terrified for her future. Brandon's family sat in the front row during the trial, their feelings clearly visible. While Brandon's sister, Chloe, sat quietly and apparently aloof, his mother, Linda Whitmore, often used tissues to wipe away tears. As they struggled with the death of their son Brandon and the terrible circumstances that led to his passing, the courtroom was filled with emotion. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours after hearing testimony for several days before rendering a decision. As the jury filed back in, the courtroom fell silent. Melissa was found guilty of murder in the second degree. Many in the crowd were taken aback because they had hoped for a reduced punishment because of the case's emotional sensitivity. Melissa seemed shocked when the court handed down a sentence of 15 years to life in jail. Her relatives watched in agony as she stayed still and cried uncontrollably. In addition to believing that justice had been served, Brandon's family members were both relieved and saddened by the loss of Brandon and the family they had known. Melissa, Gina, and Chloe's lives will never be the same after the trial. Melissa Whitmore Stanislav started her time in the Ohio Reformatory for Women and is currently serving a sentence ranging from 15 years to life. The media continued to cover her story in the months following her conviction, with publications such as the Columbus Dispatch highlighting the difficulties she faced as a transgender woman in the criminal justice system. Melissa had the everyday challenge of navigating a world that frequently contradicted her identity because she had never had the funds for gender reassignment surgery. Melissa found herself living in relative seclusion, even though her legal team worked to get better living arrangements for her. Her idealized future, one that was full of acceptance and love, had fallen apart in the most tragic manner. Melissa's mother, Gina Stanislav, returned to her position at Ohio State University as a Tibetan Buddhism professor. Gina, who was born in San Francisco, was well known for her academic work and her dedication to questioning gender and social expectations. She frequently talked about her own experiences, even as a married woman, of dressing like a guy and dating gay men. But she was closely watched during the trial. Because she wanted to protect her daughter after Brandon's public outburst, authorities had conjectured that she might have been involved in his death. Gina's troubled relationship with Brandon and her unusual lifestyle kept her under a persistent cloud of suspicion, despite her strong denials of any involvement during her interrogation. As some students and coworkers started to doubt Gina's background and her role in Melissa's turbulent life, her academic reputation suffered. Brandon's sister, Chloe Whitmore, disclosed throughout the trial that she battled alcoholism and had a brief affair with Melissa, during which she learned of Melissa's gender identification. An already complex case became much more complicated when this startling statement caused a stir in the courtroom. Following the trial, Chloe started a long and difficult road to recovery by checking herself into a nearby rehabilitation facility to deal with her alcoholism. In order to focus on her recovery while coping with her addiction and the devastating loss of her brother, she made the decision to withdraw from the spotlight. All three women experienced a lasting impact on their lives as a result of the horrific events that transpired in June 2015. A one moment of dramatic upheaval and the secrets that emerged changed their lives forever. The murder of Brandon Whitmore serves as a reminder of the severe suffering that can result from treachery, public humiliation, and hidden truths. It is a moving reminder that even the happiest moments can hide the most profound tragedies.